Everyone, we welcome you to today's hearing on the fentanyl crisis in America. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I thank the members and witnesses for coming today. As you know, this is the first hearing of this subcommittee, this Congress, and I welcome our new and returning members. The business before us today is this hearing, which is entitled, "The Fentanyl Crisis in America, Inaction is No Longer an Option." I hope my colleagues will agree that inaction is truly no longer an option concerning this crisis. The first wave of opioid deaths began in the late 1990s with an increase in overdose deaths involving prescription opioids. The second wave began in 2010 with a noticeable rise in overdose deaths involving heroin. The third most recent and deadliest wave began in 2013 with a sharp increase in overdose deaths involving synthetic opioids, particularly illicitly manufactured fentanyl and related substances. Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl, the amount that fits on the tip of a pencil, is considered a potentially lethal dose. As a committee, we began looking at this crisis years ago. We have heard from too many parents who have tragically lost their children to this poison. Between 1999 and 2020, approximately 564,000 people died from overdoses involving an opioid prescription or illicit. In 2021, however, overdose deaths surpassed 100,000, with 67% of those deaths involving fentanyl. Let that sink in. It took 20 years to record a total of 564,000 opioid overdose deaths, and in just 1 year, we saw over 100,000 opioid overdose deaths. You will hear today how communities all across this country are suffering from this poison. During the last 4 years, while we have seen these overdose deaths rise, our colleagues across the aisle have been presented with opportunities to permanently schedule fentanyl-related substances in a bipartisan manner. Instead, they have punted the problem by temporarily scheduling fentanyl-related substances. It is long past time for Congress to permanently schedule fentanyl analogs and other related substances. Unfortunately, my home state of Arizona has become the entry point for much of the illicit fentanyl entering our country. Over half of the fentanyl pills seized by the DEA last year were seized in Arizona. 2 weeks ago, law enforcement seized enough fentanyl to kill nearly 800,000 people. If we can roll that video. This was seized in the suburban Tempe suburb of Phoenix metro area. This was found in just one pickup truck. An individual traveling nearly 150 miles from the border was involved in a single vehicle accident, an auto accident, not a drug bust. When law enforcement arrived, they found 286 pounds, 1.3 million pills of fentanyl. And just this week, another 232 pounds of fentanyl worth $3 million was seized by San Diego Border Patrol from a car in San Clemente, California, 75 miles from the border, most of which were pills. I commend that these drugs were seized, but this just makes me more concerned about how many more of these hundreds-pound hauls we never identify that reach their point of distribution, the point where it can enter American towns, often through the mail, via sales that occur on social media. Now, I know our Democrat friends want us to believe that the farcical notion that all of the fentanyl crossing our borders is coming in through our ports of entry. They have said as much in recent hearings. They want you to believe that we're doing a good job detecting and seizing it before it can enter the country and destroy and take American lives. That's simply not true. And I remind them that it is the fentanyl that is actually seized that is found at legal border crossing points or interior checkpoints. That does not account for fentanyl that is not seized. And in fact, in talking to CBP and other DEA officials, I've been told that the actual amount seized is estimated to be somewhere between 10 and 15% of the overall amount of fentanyl that is being introduced into the United States. If we're being honest, it is the fentanyl that is not seized, obviously, that is killing and endangering our children and other members of our society. To ignore the smuggling that occurs between our ports of entry is simply irresponsible and dangerous. Just last month, Chief Patrol Agent John Maudlin of the Tucson sector testified that, quote, last year we seized about 700 pounds of fentanyl. To give you an idea, that's enough to kill everyone in Arizona 21 times, or half the population of the United States. That was encountered, 52% of that was encountered, so the majority of that was encountered in the field, predominantly being backpacked across the border. I'm going to emphasize that. 52% came across being backpacked across at the border. The other 48% was caught at the administration checkpoint. Will you roll the other tape, please? The video you're about to see takes place in Arivaca, just a few miles off of Nogales, about 70 miles as the crow flies southwest of Tucson. Nowhere near a port of entry, you can see. This is a ranch land. Those backpacks are not because they're going to go camping in the desert. They're bringing in illicit drugs. According to CBP statistics, December was the worst month in our nation's history for illegal migration, as measured by encounters of people, and a huge percentage of the drugs apprehended that month were between the ports of entry. When we talk about being between the ports of entry, we refer to drugs not found at a port of entry. In fact, nearly 9,000 pounds of drugs, or 44% of that month's seizures were found between the ports of entry, contrary to what you hear from our colleagues across the aisle. Job Dickinson, president of the Border Security Alliance, hit the nail on the head when he said that the cartels have, quote, developed a multi-pronged approach as to how to smuggle illegal drugs into this country. They don't just use one avenue, such as the ports of entry. They also use established smuggling routes and remote parts of the borders to get more drugs across, close quote. Cartels are smart enough to avoid sending their inventory through our X-ray and drug-sniffing dogs at the border. They walk it through the gaping, unguarded holes in our border. The number one sector for opioid smuggling is the Tucson sector. Combating this poison and those who smuggle, manufacture, and sell it should be a bipartisan issue. We need to act together to stop this scourge. I recognize in our audience today Mr. Donald Holman. He previously testified on this topic more than 3 years ago. Tragically, like the Rockwells and too many parents across America, he and his family have been forever impacted by this crisis. Mr. Holman lost his son Garrett in 2017 after he took a synthetic opioid delivered through the mail. Since then, Mr. Holman has courageously been a tireless advocate to keep these dangerous drugs out of our communities. I ask unanimous consent to enter a statement from Mr. Holman into the record, and I thank him for his presence here today. Entered into the record.